Alright, hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Star Wars Mark of Balance. My name is Mark. A couple months ago, the High Republic book initiative from Lucasfilm Publishing came to an end with the final book in the series releasing, Trials of the Jedi by Charles Soule, which was the culmination of 4 years of Star Wars storytelling in this brand new era, spanning hundreds of books, comics, manga, and even audiobook originals. I've been a huge fan of the High Republic novels, and it's the first time in my life that I actually kept up with book release dates. So I would get them pre-ordered, and the day that they dropped, they were pre-downloaded on my Kindle so that I could dive into the next chapter of this era of Star Wars storytelling. So having recently wrapped up the final book, Trials of the Jedi, I thought it was fitting to do a retrospective episode on the High Republic era as a whole. I want to discuss the highlights from this era for me, my favorite books, characters, its influence on other Star Wars media, and just the general guts to explore a new era in the Star Wars universe. But I also want to discuss the shortcomings, which I think became more and more apparent as the series went on, with the third and final phase feeling like the weakest for me, which was a bit disappointing because I think phase 1 and 2 were really great for the most part. So hopefully this episode appeals to both High Republic stans and also people that don't know about the High Republic or are interested in the High Republic, but they're a bit intimidated by the amount of content in this era. And yes, when I get into my criticisms, this is one of my main talking points because I think there are way too many stories released under this initiative in such a short period of time. But regardless, if you're a veteran of the High Republic or brand new to the High Republic, I hope you enjoy this episode. I'm excited to talk about these books because I really do think they brought a lot of great Star Wars storytelling to the galaxy far, far away. Now let's start at the beginning. The High Republic started in 2021 with Light of the Jedi, and I will openly admit that I was very skeptical of this initiative when it was first announced. I don't recall the exact reasons why, but it was coming off the heels of Rise of Skywalker, so Disney had left a very bad taste in my mouth regarding Star Wars, and maybe part of me thought it was a half-hearted initiative from Disney, but I was completely wrong, and in very un-Disney-like fashion, the High Republic was planned out. It was outlined. I recall them saying that there would be 3 phases, and that would be it, and that would be the story they were telling, so they knew the end in the beginning, maybe not all the details on how to get there, but there was a plan going into it, and they had an entire story group of authors, some that I knew, like Claudia Gray, who I absolutely love, one of my favorite Star Wars storytellers out there ever, and there was all this great concept art that was created for this initiative, and once I finally got educated to all that, I felt way more confident jumping into it, and when I did, with Light of the Jedi, which to this day is probably my second favorite Star Wars book ever, I was hooked immediately from the very first chapter. It was Star Wars to its core, from its themes of hope to selfish versus selflessness to its exploration of the Force in this brand new era where Jedi have a different mindset than the ones we see in the prequel era. It also gets back to the basics of good versus evil. Now, while all the antagonists across this series can't be simply labeled as evil, the main villains of the series, Martian Row and the Nihil, are the personification of selfishness. The galaxy is theirs for the taking, and they want complete anarchy, which is perfectly opposed to the Jedi and their teachings. This opens the door for a lot of great character arcs across our cast of Jedi, from Elzar Mann dealing with the pull to the dark side. When going up against such a brutal force like Martian Row and the Nihil, what will you become to stop them? Avar Kriss is this shining example of the Jedi Order, and she experiences self-doubt when up against these insurmountable odds. The younger generation of Jedi Padawans like Vernestra, Bell, and Burry, who are growing up and being molded by this very intense, brutal conflict where they have to apply these Padawan teachings in the field, in a war zone, and how that shapes them as they grow into Jedi Knights later on. I think Light of the Jedi just does an excellent job of introducing all of these ideas in the first book and sets the entire series up for success because the foundation here is so strong. The theme of hope is so poignant in this novel because there's this disaster that's happening across the galaxy, and we get these little vignettes into different areas that are being affected, and we see regular civilians, scientists, Jedi, and politicians all stepping up in their darkest hour to save others, whether it's sacrificing themselves for the greater good or pushing themselves to the absolute limit to save even one life and be that light in a galaxy that is shrouded in darkness at this moment. I don't think any other book across the High Republic era was able to repeat this formula to this level. I could talk about Light of the Jedi forever, but I wanted to deep dive into this book a bit because it does highlight the strengths of Phase 1 as a whole of the High Republic. And ultimately, its strengths are the reason that the High Republic continued and they were able to see it through to the end of Phase 3. Now, personally, I think Phase 1 is the strongest phase of the High Republic, and I don't really think that's up for debate. I think it's at its strongest because it's the freshest at this moment. We're exploring this new era of Star Wars. We have this new villain faction we've never seen before. We have this new threat in the Nameless that literally eat the Force, which was super cool and scary in a cosmic horror sort of way. And I think the themes and its exploration of the Jedi characters is the most interesting here. And I think later on in the phases, it becomes a bit tired and melodramatic to a degree. That's not to say that there aren't fantastic things to be found in Phase 2 and 3. I think Phase 2 has some really interesting antagonists with the Path of the Open Hand and the Mother and her Force cult. And Phase 3 really dives into the concept of love between Jedi Masters and what that means and is that allowed, while also introducing a character like Aslan, who is this fallen Jedi who tore his eyes out because of what happened to him with the Nameless. I ultimately just think Phase 1 was the bread and butter of what made the High Republic special, and that later phases were diluted by a bunch of different factors that I'll get into when I talk about the negatives and the shortcomings of the High Republic era, which honestly I think I'll get into right now because I think it's a good transition point for this. Phase 2. I really liked Phase 2. I also think it was a mistake to kill the momentum of the story and go backwards in time another 150 years before Phase 1. I know Star Wars loves to tell the story in odd ways. We start at the end and then we go back to the beginning. I get it, that's the DNA of Star Wars. But in this case, with books, I think it's a large barrier to entry with storytelling because not only are books more of a demanding medium to tell a story in, but also momentum is king. And we end the first phase with the fall of Starlight Beacon, and then we go back in time to explore this Force cult, and we're in a brand new setting, and we're kind of just thrown into it, and it ultimately builds up to be something really interesting and fresh for Star Wars. But I think in the grand scheme of the 3-phase approach, I don't know if it was the best decision. I do want to get into Phase 2 a bit more when I talk about my favorite books from the High Republic, but I want to talk about my second biggest gripe with the High Republic, and it's something I alluded to in the beginning of the video, and that's simply that they were putting out way too much content towards the end, and that it was impossible to keep up with every single story that was released across all the mediums, from audiobooks to comics to manga to mainline stories to spin-off stories. It was way too much, and I think ultimately it started to take away from the experience of the mainline story, because those spin-off books that in the first phase were just supplemental material, where you'd get interesting vignettes into side characters and events that happen tangentially to the main story, in Phase 3, those side stories contained huge revelations for answers that we wanted from Phase 1. So if you were someone who just read the mainline novels all the way through to the end, you would feel like a chunk of the story is missing, and those answers were given essentially off the page because you had to go to a completely different book to get them. And as someone who read a lot of the side stories, not all of them, I still felt like they lived in this weird state where they couldn't do anything too drastic to alter the story, but they also had to be interesting enough at the end of Phase 3 to make people want to buy them, and they weren't just throwaway stories. So you had to inject something that was a major revelation in there. So things like the Drengir, who are these monster plants that eat people, that gets solved in a side story. Key information points about the Nameless, their origin, were also answered in side stories. So I think if you just read the mainline stories of the High Republic, you'd be a bit let down. Because for me, I was personally let down and I was reading the side stories as well. So I think overall, in typical Disney fashion, they just flooded the market with content and it just started to dilute the main story. Of course, there were a lot of amazing artists and authors that were given opportunities to tell stories in the Star Wars galaxy, and I love that for them. I'm glad they were able to. But at the end of the day, the story should come first, and I think towards the end, it just started to get muddled. And that led to me feeling that Phase 3 was the weakest part of the story when I had the highest hopes for that phase to conclude it in a satisfying way. It did conclude it in a satisfying way, but it ultimately felt too easy, and the cohesion that the first phase had disappeared. Phase 3 for me felt the most meandering, with plot lines getting stretched out over several books that I think could have been wrapped up in one. For example, the Porter Angle storyline, while it was a really cool story, I think it should have wrapped up by the end of Eye of Darkness, but it ended up happening over all 3 books of Phase 3. My working theory is that the big revelations that we see in the spin-off novels of Phase 3 were originally plot points in the main novels, and they were stripped out to accommodate for attracting interest in the side novels, and that's why the main novels feel a bit bare bones. I want to take a moment to discuss the antagonist of this series, Martian Rowe, who is the leader of the Nile, this group of marauders and anarchists. He is the Eye of the Storm. I thought it was such a cool world-building decision to integrate storm imagery into the naming convention of the Nile ships and hierarchy. The commanders under Martian Rowe are Tempest Runners. These ships are called Cloud Ships, Strike Ships. They have the Storm Wall. All of these things feed into the overall idea of the Nile, which are literally a storm ravaging the galaxy. And Martian Rowe is the center of all of that. He's a very mysterious figure, and he almost has a Thrawn-like quality where he keeps his plans very close to his chest. He's very strategic, and though he does have a much higher temper than Thrawn, he is very stoic in a lot of the scenes where he's interacting with the Jedi or other members of the Nile. My favorite part about him is that he is a unique villain in the Star Wars galaxy. Over the novels, we slowly peel back the layers of Martian Rowe to understand his backstory, how he came to be the last of his species, the Virani, and why control is so important to him. Where his character falters is in Phase 3, which I think is just a result of some of the issues I already talked about. And while I think the ultimate end of his story makes sense for his character, I think it's a fitting ending for him, but it all felt a bit convenient and condensed towards the end of Phase 3, and I wish the end of his arc had a bigger gut punch and bigger revelation to his true purpose in this galaxy. Now, I can't talk about Martian Rowe without mentioning his Force-eating pets, the Nameless. They are these cosmic horror, Cthulhu-esque creatures that feed on the Force itself, and that makes them a perfect weapon for him to use against the Jedi. The Nameless are really cool in concept. We learn more about how they came to be, what their purpose is in the galaxy from a Force perspective. And I think they add that cosmic horror element that, frankly, is severely lacking from live-action Star Wars. I know the Ahsoka series introduced the Night Sister zombie stormtroopers, and I hope they keep building on that. But animation and books, especially books, Legends and canon, are not afraid to really explore these out-there ideas of cosmic horror and the mysteries of deep space and the unknown regions. I think it's such a fascinating piece of the Star Wars galaxy that deserves so much more exploration. So I think the two-handed antagonist role of Martian Rowe and the Nameless was a great way to explore not only an idea that completely opposes the Jedi with complete anarchy that Martian Rowe upholds, but also the Nameless physically eating the living Force, and sometimes that means eating Jedi. There are a lot more antagonists, but I really wanted to just focus on the main two here. Alright, now I want to talk about my favorite books from the High Republic era, and there are many. As I already talked about, Light of the Jedi is one of my favorite Star Wars stories ever. I recommend it to every Star Wars fan. Even though the series doesn't end in the strongest way, I still think this opening book stands on its own as a great Star Wars story. Rising Storm, the follow-up to Light of the Jedi, is another fantastic entry in the High Republic. It centers around this terroristic attack at this Republic World's Fair type event by the Nile, and all of those thematic strengths of Light of the Jedi are present here in this story as well. While the time jump to Phase 2 is jarring, once it establishes itself, it does have some really great Star Wars novels. I think the two-hand story of Path of Deceit and Path of Vengeance is a really unique Star Wars story that explores this Force cult led by the Mother, who has ideals that are directly opposed to the Jedi. They think the Force should be free and that no one should manipulate the Force. So they see Jedi as heretics, essentially, and a Jedi stumbles upon their space commune, I guess is the right word, and this Padawan and a young girl from the cult interact, and they start to have an affinity for each other, but they also have completely opposing viewpoints, so it creates this really interesting tension between them. And it's a great microcosm of the eventual conflict between the Jedi and the Nile. Path of Vengeance, the follow-up novel, then kicks this conflict up to 11, and we see one of the most brutal battles in all of Star Wars, the Night of Sorrow. It also features a fantastic conclusion to the arcs of two characters within the cult, Martero, the girl I mentioned before, who has feelings for the Padawan, and her cousin Yara. I love how much their lives diverge from when we first met them in Path of Deceit. Martero honestly becomes one of the most interesting characters that I've come across in Star Wars. The other book in Phase 2 that I really loved is the second entry in Phase 2 of the High Republic, and that is Cataclysm. The first book, Convergence, I think does a great job of setting the stage and introducing us to all the characters, and the stakes of Phase 2 essentially were dropped in where these two worlds have been at war for centuries. Irem and Arano, I think that's what they're called. And the solution to stop the war is to propose a marriage between the prince and princess from each world. Obviously, there are people that are fans of that and people that are not fans of that. And the younger generation really is trying to take hold of their own destiny and stop the war. Cataclysm, that all comes to a head. And I think that's when it's most interesting because all the characters that we meet in Convergence are fully in their roles at this point. And all of the players are acting at the same time. We have the Mother and the Path of the Open Hand and that Force cult being involved for some reason, a mysterious reason. We have the political factions of both worlds fighting against each other to not make the marriage happen. We have the Republic involved because it's in their interest to stop the war as well. And because the Republic's involved, we have this great character, Axel Greylark, who is the son of one of the chancellors. He is probably one of the standout characters of Phase 2, probably the standout character for most people. But he's a great, charming, egotistical, but also has the heart of gold buried deep, deep down that you want to see him just embrace that. And his journey through these books is awesome. I think Phase 2 ultimately ends in a really good spot. I really like these three books that I highlighted, but it also feels like a lot of plot threads were kind of kept open, and Phase 2 ends sort of abruptly. Now, I don't have a book to really highlight from Phase 3, and I know you guys are like, oh my god, you absolutely hated Phase 3. I didn't hate Phase 3. I enjoyed it. I think it did a good job. I just think it played it very safe, and none of these books wowed me like the previous books I've mentioned. The one I will talk about is Temptation of the Force, which is the second mainline book from Phase 3. It really explores that idea of love between Jedi Masters, and it contains one of my favorite chapters in all of Star Wars, and it's between Elzar Mann, who is one of the main characters, and Yoda. They have this fantastic conversation about Jedi and love, and if Jedi should love, and if Jedi should be in relationships. It's fantastic. It's what I loved about High Republic from the first book, that new exploration of the Force, told in a very fresh way. So I will highlight that book for that chapter specifically. So those are all my favorite books from the High Republic. There are plenty of other books that I enjoyed during my read-through, but those are the ones that stuck out to me. So overall, for me, I think the High Republic was a huge success. I'm so glad Disney explored a brand new era of Star Wars with new characters, a new antagonist, explored new mythical concepts like the Nameless and the Force Cult. While doing all of this in book form was the least risk for Disney because they knew the least amount of fans would interact with this medium, I still have to give them credit for taking the risk to start a brand new era of Star Wars, and it influenced some stories. I mean, we see some references in Jedi Survivor. The Acolyte was set during the High Republic, even though it was the end of the High Republic, and it didn't do anything to establish this era for new fans, so it was kind of a nothing burger, but they based a live-action Star Wars show off this era, which is a pretty big deal. I hope more stories are told in the visual medium during the High Republic era. I think it's a rich time to show to more fans, not just book readers. I think its exploration of the Jedi at this time being a bit different than the ones we see in the prequel era. They ask more questions, they're more open, they're more empathetic to people across the galaxy. They're given a bit more freedom to explore the Force as they see fit. It's just generally a more diverse group of Jedi, and I think that would be really interesting to see in a visual medium. The High Republic initiative was far from perfect. They were held back from a couple decisions like Phase 2 jumping back in time after the huge momentum of Phase 1. And in the end, Disney did what Disney does, and they released way too much content and storytelling in such a short period of time of 4 years that the mainline story got muddled in all of it, and I think it lost the plot a bit, which was unfortunate, but still, they did land the plane. It was a satisfying ending, and I still enjoyed the ride all the way through. If you're thinking about jumping into the High Republic, I encourage you to. If it's not for you, it's not for you. But I do think there is a high chance that you'll really enjoy this era of Star Wars storytelling, because I know I did. And if you're a High Republic vet like me, for light and for life. Thank you guys so much for watching or listening. Please like and subscribe. Comment below what your favorite book from the High Republic era is, or if you're going to jump into the High Republic after watching this video. I want to hear from you. Let's talk High Republic. And as always, stay safe, stay healthy, and may the Force be with you. Peace.